wild out here.
Okay.
Not Larkin's going wild, it's Braxton's going wild.
Thanks everyone for being here for the June 11th business meeting with the Charlotte City Council. I apologize, we're starting a little bit late today. So we're going to start off with mayor and council consent questions. And so far, for me, we have number 33 has a speaker, 47 has a speaker, and 2 items have been moved to the business agenda from the consent agenda. That's items 30 and 44. Both of them have to do with the stadium and the rail trail. So those will be on your business agenda. So with that, do we have anyone that would like to pull any item from the consent agenda aside from those 33 and 47 that I've mentioned? Would anyone like to have a let me be more clear. Would anyone like to have a separate vote on any item on the consent agenda? Mr. Braxton Winston.
Good save. I would like to pull item number 35 for a separate discussion and vote, please.
All right, we got 35. Anything else? Do we have any that people would like to comment on before we take our motion? Comments? Okay, going, Mr. Phipps, do you want to comment?
I had a question.
We're going to have questions. We're going to come back and check in at the end, so we'll go ahead and get started. So today, Mr. Harrington is going to help us with questions on the agenda, and we have some that are on at our places that have been asked. So do you have one that you want to go ahead and ask?
Oh, I can ask it?
Yes.
It's the one that's talk about the Tuckasegee Airport annexation, voluntary annexation. I just wanted to know how many acres of airport-owned public land that hasn't been voluntarily annexed yet.
Well, we can get that information in a
Yes.
report. Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Okay, we'll do
We'll
the
follow
report.
up on that.
And why hasn't it been annexed? I want to know that too.
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you very much. All right, so with that, any other questions on the agenda, on the consent agenda?
That's everybody.
If not, thank you, Mr.
Great.
Harrington.
Thank you.
You've got the answers Dr. Harlow asked and Mr. Winston asked in front of you. All right.
Madam Mayor,
Yes?
if I could just point out one item. At your place setting, you have a revised write-up for number 10. Item number 10, the South End Vision Plan, revised action plan. Essentially, just what happened was a final version didn't get uploaded in the original information that you got, and there were some references to the vision plan and some separate amendments, and it was maybe a little bit confusing how it was worded. So there were some revisions made just to condense the action and simplify it just a little bit. So that's what you have before you tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you.
With that, Mr. Jones, any comments on today's action review or
No,
on our agenda?
no, Mayor. Members of council, we would be ready to just start with the first presentation.
All right, Mr. Driggs.
I did have one question on the South End Vision Plan. Is that business or,
It is on our policy agenda. It will come up for questions, but if it's
Yeah.
something that you need research.
I'll just mention the question is whether there's any funding associated with this, because we've seen situations where we agree to a plan like sidewalks, and then suddenly something pops up and they said, well, you approved this, now we're just carrying it out. So I'd like to know what kind of funding commitment could be implied by our acceptance of this plan.
Thank you. So we'll have that answered, how we manage that, because we know that we don't have the money to do everything. If there are no other questions, we're going to move to a presentation. Ms. Ajmira, would you like to introduce this as our environmental chair?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So Mr. Focus will walk us through the presentation that will include a resolution that was approved by the committee. It's a bold step forward with sustainable and resilient Charlotte. And this is a resolution which doesn't only focus on energy, but also focuses on environmental sustainability. And it was vetted by over 24 stakeholder groups, which includes environment organizations, faith and business communities. And this is the first time we also have had Duke Energy at the table. we heard it very loud and clear last year that we didn't want the resolution that was aspirational. But this resolution, you will see, is very inspirational, not aspirational, inspirational and achievable. And I hope that you will support this when it comes up for a vote on 25th. And if you have any technical questions, that's why we have Rob Focus here. With that,
Thank you. Well, before Rob starts, I'd just like to recognize Mayor Jennifer Roberts for being here. This is something that was very important to her, and I'm glad that she's hanging tough with us. And I know she's got a posse with her as well, and we say hello. We say hello to all the posse members. So, Mr. Focus, would you please start us off?
Thank you, Mayor, council members. Always a pleasure to be in front of you. So as Councilmember Ajmira said, tonight we're going to talk about the Sustainable and Resilient Charlotte by 2050 resolution. But I also want to send another goal that we have is also, hold on a second. We'll move to the keyboard. Is not only talking about the resolution, but setting the larger context of all the work that staff has been doing towards setting targets for the year 2050. So the agenda for tonight, I want to touch on some history and especially some terminology, because this is a very complex area. I want to talk about the targets that we will be proposing, talk about the Strategic Energy Action Plan, talk about the resolution, of course, and then touch on next steps as well. So this work in particular dates back to 2015 when Mayor Clodfelter signed onto the Global Covenant of Mayor's Commitment. And as part of this commitment, and I'll mention that Mayor Roberts also signed onto that as well when her term began, the city agreed to accomplish 4 things that are listed here. Register the commitment, which we did by the mayor signing on. Complete a greenhouse gas emissions inventory and report this to a group called the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a group that works internationally both with businesses and with municipalities to help them measure and report their greenhouse gas emissions. We wanted to create greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and establish a system of measurement, which is incredibly important to the work we're doing. And then finally establish a strategic energy action plan, which will detail the actions that we as a community will need to take to achieve those targets. By accomplishing these 4 goals, Charlotte is going to be able to join a global community of cities that are striving to meet the goals that have been spelled out by the Paris Climate Accord. So this work really began in earnest back in the summer of 2017 when we partnered with Envision Charlotte to collect the data and to develop our greenhouse gas baseline and to formally report it out to CDP. So as Mayor Lyles mentioned, back in November 2017, Mayor Roberts introduced to the council a resolution that, among other things, would commit the city to 100% clean energy by 2050. The City Council voted to send the resolution, that work, back to the Environment Committee for further discussion. There were 2 charges that traveled with that request. One was to draft a resolution that was appropriate and tailored for Charlotte, recognizing our unique regulatory environment and just the uniqueness of Charlotte. And then also to develop an action plan for how those goals would be achieved. Staff developed a draft resolution that was presented to the Environment Committee on April 30th. We had feedback from the committee, we had feedback from stakeholders, and then just this past week we presented edited resolution to the committee that was passed by a vote of 4-1. So I want to talk a little bit about how this work aligns, because there have been lots of other efforts that staff and the community have undertaken. So in light of council's feedback in November and their charge to the Environment Committee, the requirements under the Global Covenant of Mayors, council's desire to be a global leader, which is spelled out in the Environment Focus Area Plan, and the desire to work not only on just internal operations, but as a whole community towards this plan, we began working toward a much more comprehensive strategy than was first outlined in that November resolution. So we saw an opportunity to align the Focus Area Plan goals, the Covenant of Mayor goals, and the desire to be a leader in this field and set a low-carbon future for that city. So again, beginning in November 17th, we started working very closely with Envision Charlotte, who has been a partner of the city, as you know, in many leading efforts, especially in energy. And the blueprint for our work is to complete the commitment requirements under the Global Covenant of Mayors to deliver that greenhouse gas baseline and the Strategic Energy Action Plan and other plans as well that impact the emissions that we have in Charlotte. For example, our circular economy work we'll be doing under a comprehensive plan. It's important to note that all of these different plans are interconnected, that they just can't stand alone. Before we get into the terminology here, I wanted to provide a little context, which I think is really important and really came to light as we were working with the Environment Committee and with the stakeholder groups. So a few points before we get into that. Charlotte has always desired to be a global leader in this field. But this is the first time that we as staff and as a community have undertaken an energy action plan or any plan that sets goals to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. It's also the first time we're ever undertaking a circular economy strategy as well, and as I mentioned, that's connected. The importance of this work across the world really, I think, was emphasized when Mayor Bloomberg a few weeks announced a new challenge to the 100 biggest cities in the United States. It's called the American Cities Climate Challenge. And Mayor Bloomberg is putting up $70 million to work with 20 cities in the United States over 2 years to provide them with not only human resources, but also technical resources. And the goal is for that money, for this community that's developed, to help those 20 cities achieve their greenhouse gas reduction goals by 2050. One of the first requirements for that is for the city to show its commitment through a letter from that city's mayor, and we've talked both to the Environment Committee and to Mayor Lyles about submitting that letter, which is due on the 19th, so that is in process. And then the larger application is due July 18th. We don't know what the questions are. Those won't be released until June 19th. But again, I think it just shows the significance of the work we're undertaking and how important it is for us to be a global leader. Second, as with all the cities that are undertaking this work,
Oh, I just had a question, Rob. How many cities do you think would be competing for that award
so it's
money?
open to 100, and I would suspect almost probably 100 of those cities will be applying for it. In my experience, when it comes to the area of sustainability, and there's an opportunity for money and for strategic alliances, that cities jump at that opportunity. So I think it'll be very competitive. I think we are in a very good position to apply for it, though, with the work, with the resolution, with the Strategic Energy Action Plan, with the circular economy work. If this opportunity came a year ago, I would be hesitant for the city to apply.
Thank you.
Sure. So as I was mentioning, the approach to these challenges that we have to take have to be new approaches. They have to be innovative. They have to be creative. They're going to involve partnerships with private partners, with nonprofit partners, with other municipal entities as well. And it's going to take persistence and it's going to take commitment. We're going to need to think out of the box to achieve the goals that we're setting. To that point, this is a very long-term time frame. We're talking about goals to be set in the year 2030 and the year 2050. There will be intermediary requirements, but it's a very long-term framework that we're developing. It's also important to notice that it's not just focused on energy, as I mentioned. There are other sectors that impact our greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, it's important to note that Charlotte faces its own unique challenges and idiosyncrasies. As opposed to some cities that we'll be competing with, we don't own our own energy company. Some cities do. We have a regulatory environment that is different than a lot of other cities. So we need, as we're doing this work, to recognize that and to factor it in as well. So let's touch on the terminology a bit. The terminology can be very confusing. It's very technical. There are terms of art, but the terms that we have chosen to use are ones that are recognized not only nationally, but internationally as well. So just quickly running through these, renewable energy includes wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, and bioenergy. It also includes storage. When we're talking about clean energy, we're talking about renewables, but it can also include nuclear. It's also important to note that some groups, especially in the United States, when you're talking about clean energy, take that to mean clean coal and natural gas. We are not including that in our definition when we're talking about clean energy. Zero carbon, which you'll see referenced throughout the resolution, talks about, includes renewables and nuclear where necessary. And it's important for us to recognize that we have 2 nuclear power plants that provide a significant amount of our power, and they will for several decades to come. And then finally, the term low carbon spans across all greenhouse gases in all sectors, in energy, waste, industrial processes, and agriculture as well. One of the most important terms is this one here, CO2 equivalent. There's a difference between just CO2 and CO2 equivalent. And the main difference is when you include that little e, the equivalent, you are covering all greenhouse gases. So for example, methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, more potent than carbon dioxide, is covered when you're referring to when you see CO2e. So when you're reading the resolution, and you'll see some references in the PowerPoint forthcoming, you'll see that E. So what does it mean? It's a way to express the impact of the different greenhouse gases in terms of the impact of CO2. So if you look at that last bullet point, 1 kilogram of methane is equivalent to 25 kilograms of carbon dioxide over 100 years. So the first thing we did, as I mentioned earlier, was to work on developing a greenhouse gas baseline and some future targets. The data collection that we undertook included data work that we had done in the past around greenhouse gases, but like I said in November, we began in earnest to get the best baseline we possibly could. The past efforts were not as detailed, they were not as comprehensive, and there were also new tools and methodology that allowed us to get more specific. Another point that I'd like to make is that Duke Energy has provided much more detailed data than we have ever had before. They have come to the table like we've never had them come to the table before. We've had a great working relationship with them, and that's something we expect to continue. And our goals, this work cannot be achieved if Duke Energy is not actively participating in the work we're doing. So we use the CDP spreadsheets to input the numbers, and our baseline year compared to other cities is the year 2015. Other cities strive to start earlier. We believe 2015 is the year we can get the most accurate data for the work that we want to do. One last point there, 12 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year is what each of us produces right now. So we are looking at this on an individual basis. I think one of the reasons that that is really powerful is because this makes it a much more personal goal. We all have a role in the work that we're going to do here, and when we're able to talk about tons of carbon dioxide that each of us is emitting per year, I think it really emphasizes that, that role. You'll see there it says the national figure is 16 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year, so Charlotte is lower. One of the main reasons for that is that we don't have a lot of industry inside the city limits, whereas when you look at other cities, they do, and that's what's driving up their annual total. So here are our initial targets, what we're striving for. I mentioned as of 2015, 12 tons of CO2 per person per year. Our goal by 2030 is to get that down to 7 tons, and by the year 2050, it's to get that down to less than 2 tons of carbon dioxide. And as you can see there, that puts us in line with the goals of the Global Covenant of Mayors. The second thing that we are working on is developing the Strategic Energy Action Plan, which was of key importance to the Council back in November when we were initially discussing the resolution. So this document is going to lay out the roadmap for how we're going to achieve our 2030 and our 2050 goals, how we are going to be having, how we're going to have a low carbon future. We have partnered, as I said, very closely with Envision Charlotte. They have brought in an international expert, Dr. Sebastian Carney, who has developed a model that cities around the world have used to set these targets. And we've been working very closely with the stakeholder group, as Mayor Lyles mentioned early
I
on.
wanted you to recognize your
Sure.
assistants. Would you please stand? Thank you so much for your work in helping us do this.
So the work that we've been doing with Dr. Carney and Vision is outlined there in bullet point 3. We've been hosting what we're calling future scenario workshops, where we had city staff, Duke Energy personnel, really understanding what we as a community are going to do to achieve these goals. And then we've also hosted, and will continue to host, meeting with community stakeholders. Councilmember Ajmira pulled together stakeholders who haven't had an opportunity to have at least 2 conversations with us to discuss what we're doing in the resolution. So the framework for the CAP, as we call it, there are 4 pillars. It's focused on the building sector, the transportation sector, how we generate our energy, and then the piece that underlines all of this again is innovation. Innovation is going to really be driving what Charlotte's doing, what cities across the world are doing. And we will continue to build strategies as we move forward that will make up the Energy Action Plan, and this will all be presented to the City Council in the fall. So quickly, why a low-carbon future? Again, recognize that when you're talking low carbon, it's not just the energy, but we're talking about the circular economy, our waste, agriculture, and industrial processes. The CAP can't deliver on all these things. It'll take different plans to get there, but the Energy Action Plan is a huge piece of this. Why are we doing this? I think the main reason is we want to be a globally competitive city. Charlotte cannot compete with not only cities in the United States, but internationally if we're not undertaking work as a community to recognize our greenhouse gas emissions and how we're going to reduce them. And of course, it increases the quality of life through our residents. Air quality, for example, as you are decreasing your emissions, you're improving the air quality for your residents. So the goals of the resolution. We wanted to demonstrate Council's commitment to the low carbon future. We wanted to set end goals, and we wanted to do this through the Energy Action Plan and the circular economy. We wanted to be responsive to what was in the original resolution, but also the comments we heard from Council back in November and that we've heard from the committee as we've gone along. We wanted to keep the resolution high level, which is our norm, and not get into specific details. And we wanted to use this as a call to action for our partners and for our community. The details will come in the plans that we're putting forward, in the Energy Action Plan, for example. So in summary, the resolution you have before you encompasses our commitment to the Global Covenant of Mayors. It's a broader resolution than what Council saw in November, but it does include renewable energy in the goals that we're setting. It identifies and specifies that the CAP will be completed. It'll provide an action plan, and that will be coming back to Council in November. Importantly, it includes a municipal goal for the year 2030, but it also has a community goal for the year 2050. And it mentions that we're going to continue all the great work that staff has been doing already to reduce our carbon footprint. One point I want to make is that, as I said, the resolution was passed in the committee 4-1. As we continue to work on it and get it ready.
Mayor.
Yes.
Thank you. I would just like to clarify it. So even though it was passed 4-1, it was because of some technical questions, but I did have a conversation with Mr. Phipps, and he's on board with it. So I just wanted to clarify that he's not against sustainable initiatives. He's very well supportive of it.
If I may add, Mayor, the way that the motion was constructed, you know, they had some language.
I wasn't there, no, I don't know.
They had language that we wanted to change, and they had 2 options, but instead of voting for those things separately, they included it as one lump sum, like they wanted.
You can blame me for that.
Yeah, I mean, had they just voted for that and that went away, but I would have been in favor of advancing it forward. So I just, thank my colleague, Mr. Winston.
So we can count on your support. So that's 5 votes.
I don't think I heard him say that, but if you did, but if you heard him say that, I'm going with you. All right, the chair has ruled that it's a 5-0 vote coming forward. Okay.
So the last
Let's go
point
ahead.
I'd like to make before we get next steps is that we did identify one technical change, a clarification we wanted to make, just to make sure the language is clear. And I know Councilmember Ajmir has talked with the Environment Committee members and gotten their blessing to move forward. In particular, if you go to the very last clause in the resolution where it says, now therefore be it further resolved, you'll see toward the end that says, we're going to address our buildings and fleet from zero carbon sources, and then there's a comma, it says including renewables and nuclear, comma, by 2030. That phrase will be removed when this is presented in the RCA to the council for the final vote on June 25th, which is the next step for this.
Thank you very much. But I wanted to go back and ask, can you tell me where to start? I would strike the words.
So if you go, let me just read the whole.
Okay,
phrase
now
here.
therefore,
So now therefore be it further resolved that the City of Charlotte will strive to source 100% of its energy use in its building and fleet from zero carbon sources, including renewables and nuclear. That is what will be stricken when it comes forward to the full council on the 25th, but it will still include by 2030.
so we're deleting including renewables from zero. Say what you want us to cross
So
out.
cross out including renewables and nuclear.
That's what I wondered. Okay. All right. Thank you.
So,
Are there any questions on the presentation? If not, then I'll open it up for discussion. I'm going to recognize the chair, Mr. Driggs, and then Mr. Winston. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Driggs.
Thank you. On the initial targets, 12 tons of CO2 in 2015, are these the quantities generated by activity of the city, or is this the city's total production?
This is the city 300 square miles total production.
So when we set these goals in the future, we're not only talking about managing ourselves, we're talking about a plan that includes everybody else.
That's correct.
And I assume that's based on the voluntary participation of all of those parties and not some legislative action that we intend to take. Is that right?
That is correct.
So, and the other thing that I can't see from this is this could say the goal is 6 or the goal is 9, and basically you don't have a plateau like that. You've got a trade-off between the investment that you make and the outcome you're willing to achieve. So you can go for the super high efficiency air conditioner, which is more expensive, or you can get one that's at an intermediate SER price point. And therefore, in order to judge this and its feasibility, it would be interesting to know how did we kind of incorporate the costs of attaining these goals into the definition of this particular program?
So costs, as with everything we do, are very important. When we are working on the Energy Action Plan, there'll be an opportunity for us to have much more discussion about costs. I think one of the reasons, or one of the issues with cost is because it's such a long timeline that it's often very difficult to understand what the costs are going to be, especially when you're thinking of the innovations that will be coming about. But you're exactly right, Council Member. As we always have, and as is part of the resolution, there is a balance between costs and value and the benefits that we're getting, and that's part of the discussion we have to have. But I think it's also important to recognize, in addition to the cost, there's a huge value to what we're doing here, and we'll work to do our best to quantify that.
So I recognize that value. I just would repeat what I said before. We adopt this framework, which is a good goal, and it's something that we should pay attention to. But that doesn't imply that everything that comes forward later is deemed to be merely administrative approval pursuant to this adopted plan. There are many important decisions that still have to be made, and they're not going to be made in the context of some presumption because we agreed to this target, that we also have to be ready to agree to such and such costs, right?
Right.
We will have further conversations about individual steps that will be taken towards that when we know more about the details.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Bakari.
Thanks. I share all the same elements that Councilman Driggs just said. The specific question I have is along those lines, and the same exact one I asked you last week, so you have a heads up. So we know that we can't quantify a lot of the evolutionary items in technology that will occur. In the 2050 plan, which is somewhat out of our control because that requires a lot of partnership when we get to that point, but more of the 2030 plan direct in our control. So the question is, did you quantify in some form, even if it was loose, for the manager to be able to see what he is up against each year in the budget between now and then to actually bring this to fruition by using today's technology, estimating what it would take? And then the idea I gave you was look back over the last 20 years in how much technology has evolved there and just use that as a proxy for the percentage in cost efficiencies that would occur, because I'd love to know if it's 100 million, or 100 billion, right? I mean, just some relative sense. So were you able to do that?
We did not have an opportunity to do it at that level and, for example, sit down with the manager. I think what we can strive to do is, as I mentioned in the last meeting, provide you with an idea of what some of the shorter-term goal costs have been in relation to projects that we have undertaken. But even when we look at a 2030 goal, it is going to be very difficult to quantify, even for our own internal operations, what that cost will be. But we have been doing work, for example, to cost out things like what would the cost of bioenergy, if we were to use bioenergy in our fleet as opposed to diesel be. We didn't have the time to get that together by tonight.
Is it, with all the estimation that you could possibly do, if you look at the midway point between 500,000 and 500 million, which one is it closer to?
I wouldn't want to pick a particular number on that.
And that's the only thing that makes me uncomfortable, that we can't even ballpark it within that realm right now. So I love the idea, love the work you put into it. I think it's brilliant approach for us. I just think we have to get more disciplined in how we quantify these numbers, at least at some high level. Thank you for the work.
Mr. Winston, and
I
then
just wanted to respond.
you want Ms. Hajmiri has a response to you, Mr. Bukhari.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I know Mr. Bukhari had brought this up at our Environment Committee meeting. So when we put together Strategic Energy Action Plan, which is underway, we are visiting all departments, our internal city departments, and coming up with our short-term, mid-term, and long-term plan that will give you some ideas around how much it's going to cost. And I think it will give you more details as to what you are looking for, Mr. Bukhari. So that will be addressed in the Strategic Energy Action Plan, which will come out in fall.
Mr. Winston.
Well, I'll give you one high-level quantification, is that this will cost less than it will cost should we not adopt it and we don't aspire to these goals.
That's where I was going.
I think I don't have a numerical value for that, but I can, I will submit that as fact.
So closer to 500 million?
Shoulder shrugs don't go on the record, do they? But I just wanted to talk in favor of this to my colleagues. I do believe that this is an inspirational piece of policy, as Madam Chair framed it earlier today. And it really does allow us to utilize our bully pulpit as a city, as an organization that has tremendous buying power and influence over what kind of products come to our market and what kind of technologies are explored in this area in any kind of field, but specifically as it pertains to the environment and sustainability. So what this resolution will do, along with the subsequent action plan, it will put pressure on the market and other folks that play in the spaces that we play in to bring new and innovative solutions to achieve these goals. I think we're doing it in the right order. And this can be a sort of a mini framework where we need to go with our comprehensive vision plan and UDO process to say, hey, this is what we want. Now we're going to put the tools in place to get there. And even kind of thinking about that comprehensive vision and playing it into the UDO. This resolution is going to shape that vision. How do we develop our city in the long run over the 2040 or 2050 kind of time frame that we look to? How do we build our roads? How do we build buildings? What do we expect developers to look at when they're coming to us and for rezonings? These are the type of big, bold steps that we can take to really shape the future of our city. And just as Mr. Focus said, not simply as it pertains to, directly to sustainability models, but how we do business all across really every department in this organization. So I encourage you guys who haven't been able to look at it like we've been able to look at it on the Environment Committee and have the conversations that we've been having to do that. Really wrap your heads around it to figure out how to, again, really use our bully pulpit to influence a different charted path for our city in this region.
Yes, Ms. Edgemere?
Yeah, and to all my colleagues on this council, I think this is an opportunity for us to leave a lasting impact. I mean, you're talking about environment. You're going to be talking about the impact that we are going to leave for 30, 40, 50 years to improve a quality of life for all Charlotteans. So I think this will have a lasting impact, as you can see, until 2050 and even longer for clean air for our next generation, and clean water, and so many other sustainability initiatives. So this is a bold step forward that I think we must take.
Mr. Winston?
Just to complete my thought, a good example, I think, of this, how we'll have to use our pulpit also not to demand, but also gain partnerships. Part of the decision that we had to make, we had an option to include all of our city fleet vehicles or just kind of our light-duty trucks. And we decided to go with all. And it's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging, especially when we look at some of our heavy fleet vehicles like dump trucks and garbage trucks. Let's be honest, the feasibility and technology do not match right now as where we stand in 2018. But to get there, and which we are hopefully going to approve moving forward, we're setting high goals for future councils, not just to come up with solutions to what we're putting on the table, but to partner with other stakeholders in this community that will have like-minded situations in helping us reach these aspirations, whether it's perpetuating the construction industry that we're feeling right now, or that these are the type of difficult kind of watermarks that we're setting, but they're so necessary and really does continue to play in to the way we do business with public-private partnerships, but I think really does push it a step further and really kind of puts us in the driver's seat.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for the work of the committee. I would just ask that we try to use some words like citizens and the entire community in some of this, capital C sometimes often means just us, and we don't want, so it's a small thing, but thank you. The work has been phenomenal. Look forward to the plan. So the next item that we have on our agenda today is the bond referendum schedule and city council actions required to implement. And Mr. Harrington's going to go over that for a few minutes with us. If we have time before our 6:30 start, we will have a closed session today. All right? Let's see if we can do it before the meeting if we can. All right, Mr. Harrington.
Thank you, Mayor and members of council. My name is Randy Harrington. It's my pleasure to walk you through tonight, just real briefly, the 2018 General Obligation Bond Referendum Overview. And really, this is a process overview. And before I give it, I have to say that there's one really big assumption built into this presentation. And that big assumption is that you adopt a budget tonight that includes a community investment plan. So I'm just going to preface that right out of the gate. But assuming you do that, there are a series of steps that are required by general statutes that the City Council has to follow to actually put the general obligation bond referendum in process and to ensure that we follow all legal components. So I just want to walk through those with you then here this evening. So with that, I'll provide you a little bit of an overview of the schedule, some of the required actions that the council must take, and then discuss briefly the roles, really around what's the role of the city, and then what's the role of the partner, really the Chamber of Commerce, who is a partner in this particular process for the 2018 bond referendum. So the actions, and again, these are what I would describe as routine. They're consistent with what council has seen and done in prior years. And again, they're prescribed in general statutes, and there's really, there's no flexibility, so to speak, around it. They're just basic components that all cities and counties have to follow in North Carolina. So some of the key requirements. There are 4 actions by City Council. I'm going to touch on those in the next slide. Within this, there are elements of public notifications as well as a required public hearings on each of the 3 bond components. The submission of the ballot language will go to the Board of Elections by August. And I'll tell you a little bit more why August is such an important date. And then obviously there's a bond referendum vote by the citizens of Charlotte. So let me outline here the timeline from now through November. And when this pops up, the blue will denote council actions, again, per the North Carolina general statutes. So we'll start in June. So tonight, what you'll have before you, after you adopt the budget, will be an action to approve resolutions to apply to the Local Government Commission for the 2018 bond referendum. And with that, there will be a notice, a publicized notice of intent to apply to the Local Government Commission. That will be in the public. And then you'll actually authorize the city manager and myself to actually apply then to the Local Government Commission before you take your next action. So the next action in June, at the end, on June 25th, will be what we would call or formally introduce the bond orders. And these are this is the bond language for the 3 components that voters will see around transportation, neighborhood improvements, and then affordable housing. And then as well, you will also set a public hearing for those 3 components at your July meeting. So then we move into July. You'll hold the public hearings. You have to hold 3 public hearings, 1 for each of those components on transportation, housing, and neighborhood improvements. And then you'll formally set the bond referendum date for November 6th. Now, you wonder, why does it line up this particular way? And I alluded to this just a little bit earlier. But in early August, we are required to provide the Board of Elections with your approved bond order language, what the voters will see when they go to the ballots in terms of what they vote on. And that the reason for August 6th, you might think, well, gosh, that's early. The Board of Elections, they have to design the ballots, they have to build them, they have to print absentee ballots and prepare for early voting. And so that ramps up that schedule into the late summer time frame. And then when we get to November, there will be 2 components. One is obviously the bond vote, and this will be done by the citizens of Charlotte. And then following that, you will receive from the Board of Elections information about the vote, and you'll have to adopt a resolution to certify and declare the results of the referendum. And at that time, the city clerk will read for the record what those vote tallies were, and then you will adopt that formally into the record. So those are the 4 key steps that council will take. Again, these are routine and prescribed quite explicitly by general statutes. Just as a reminder, so what types of investments, and I've already alluded to this in my previous comments, voters will see 3 components around. They'll vote separately on transportation investments. They'll vote separately on neighborhood investments, and then as well on housing investments. And so a total of $223.1 million in bond referenda will be before the voters. And then what roles will you play, and then what role does our partner play, the Charlotte Chamber? So for the city, and these are really important components for the city. as I mentioned earlier, the council approves the planned investments for the 2018 bond referendum, which again, assuming that you'll do tonight. And the mayor and council, you can engage in advocacy. And so advocacy being, in the nature of your political role in the community, you can advocate for or against or any one type of way of how you think voters should vote for the bonds. But the city cannot use any funds to endorse or oppose the referendum. And also, staff cannot engage in any advocacy, but we can help provide educational information, factual information. What is the project? How much? What are the goals of that particular project? Staff can provide that type of information. Again, neutral, fact-based, and information-oriented. And then the partner, the Charlotte Chamber. The Charlotte Chamber runs the bonds campaign, the advocacy component for that. And then as well, the Chamber will do fundraising from the private sector to actually run that particular campaign. I know tonight we have Keith Kelly over here on the left side with the Charlotte Chamber, who's with us tonight. So those are the key roles that for the city and for staff in the process that you will see here over the next several months, and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Are there any questions of the staff? It's okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Harrington. I appreciate that. It's always good to have a refresher on things like that. So, we are going to follow up. Were there any other items to be that you would like to like to comment on, or have a separate vote on for tonight's agenda before I ask for a motion to go into closed session? All right. So I'd have a motion. I'm sorry, Mr. Manager, do we have anything else? We're good?
We're good.
So we're good? All right, so if we're good, I'd need a motion that we go into closed session pursuant to GS 143-318.11A3 to consult with attorneys employed or retained by the city in order to preserve the attorney-client privilege, and to consider and give instructions to the attorneys concerning the handling or settlement of City of Charlotte versus 8600 Charlotte Properties LLC, -13 CVS 5535.
So moved.
Second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. So if you gentlemen and ladies would clear the room.